Hello, listeners. If you haven't liked, subscribed, or followed the Sounds of Living podcast accounts, you could find us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Patreon at Sounds of Living Podcast. Any donation would be greatly appreciated to help support my journey of taking Sounds of Living around the United States. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to Sounds of Living. I'm your host today, Alex Kellerman, and I'm sitting here with Martin O'Sullivan. Martin, say hello.
Hi, folks. Good to be with you today.
How are you doing, Martin?
I'm doing fine.
So, Martin, why don't you tell everybody how we met?
Well, I lived at Sagewood, which is a senior living community, and Alex was one of our valued servers working in food and beverage and making sure that the residents got their food ordered and prepared and delivered to the table. A very valuable thing. We do several hundred meals a day here, and he was part of the team that made that happen.
Awesome. And I really liked serving you guys because you had so many great stories to tell. And when I had heard about your connection with Lee Burke and the music industry, I had to get to know you. So I was wondering, do you mind telling us about like your relationship with Mr. Burke?
Yes, absolutely. So I moved here 10 or 12 years ago. I have an interest in music, and we had a few hundred residents at the time. We would take a bus out to a club and hear some music and come back. So that entailed, driving out, driving back, and spending a few bucks on music. And so one day I was introduced to Lee Burke, who was the former president of Berklee College of Music in Boston, which is, I think, the largest jazz-focused educational institution, at least in the country, if not in the world. And we were kind of observing that we could actually bring music into our property for less money and more convenience than taking a bus full of people and going out once a week or however often to hear the music in town. In short order, it only took 10-15 minutes, we conceived a way of doing this by having the residents form a voluntary group called the Patrons, which would contribute $100 a year per patron. And if we got 40 people to do that, we could put on live jazz. And so we put out a little memorandum to our friends and neighbors who we thought might be supportive. We collected the $4,000 and we put on 6 live concerts with local musicians. And from that original 40 patrons, now we have over 350, and we're bringing in musicians at a very high level. So Lee Burke had been a producer of music in his community in Santa Fe, New Mexico, after he retired from being a president of his college. And so he had a background in booking and making arrangements to have professional musicians come to a community. And I picked it up from him by just learning by doing, as the old phrase goes. And it came very easily because I happen to know a lot of local musicians because I'd been here for 77 years here in the Valley. And I knew most of the local musicians who were performing at the Nash Club and at the Scottsdale Arts and places like the Sacred Grounds Coffee House. So between Lee's knowledge of the industry broadly and mine of locally, we put together some very nice concerts. Our local musicians did very well and entertained people, and they became engaged about it and wanted to hear more.
That's fantastic. And I'm glad that you guys were able to establish this relationship based on music, especially since it's been like one of the things that's been constant for both of your guys' lives. And to finally like come together 12 years ago to have created this group of people that were able to come together and listen to music at Sagewood, like that's awesome.
And of course, Lee's wonderful spouse, Susan Burke, was also part of the discussion about how to make this happen at our senior living community. She'd been working side by side with Lee during his college presidency and was a very active person in the community, very personable, knows a lot of people, and just her association with it enabled people to get a feeling of confidence that their money would be well spent.
That's fantastic. And just to get back to you, why don't you tell us about what got you into music in the first place?
I was an only child, and I grew up in the late 30s and 40s, and I had a radio. The radio was kind of my buddy in my room, and in those days in Chicago, there were a wealth of radio stations. This was in the blossoming days of radio. We had ethnic stations, so we had a Yiddish station, could hear klezmer music, had a Polish station, could hear polkas. Had big band stations, could hear the bands from the major hotels in Chicago and New York. I just got a nice feeling about music, but no aptitude to play an instrument. I've never really learned to play an instrument, but I just appreciate listening to music and the energy and the feeling that it conveys.
So how old were you when the David Brubeck Quartet concert happened at the U of A?
I was probably around 18, 19 years old. The Dave Brubeck Quartet was on a tour. They were based out of Northern California, and Dave needed to make some money for his growing family, as the story goes. So he got a station wagon, loaded up his quartet, and they began traveling from one college to the next and did just a host of engagements across the country. And one of the engagements was at the University of Arizona, happened to be in the Student Union, and it was not in the major theater that we had. Dave Brubeck's name was probably not too well known at the time, and our major theater was booking in big acts that had a lot of notoriety and whatever. At any rate, he appeared in a nice conference room, did a 1-hour concert with the original quartet, which was frankly the best aggregation that Dave Brubeck ever put together, his original quartet, which included Paul Desmond on alto sax, Joe Morello on drums, and a gentleman on the bass. So it was a very, very impressive concert. The interchange between the players in that quartet were rather amazing. You could tell they were communicating with one another about how to play and what to emphasize. Highly professional. Dave Brubeck, of course, composed much of his music, so we heard things like Take Five and other tunes that he composed. He had been a student of a classical composer at his university in California, so he's very skilled at that. Made a big impression.
So when you were watching this concert, did you know that you wanted to be in the music industry like right then and there?
Well, I've never actually been in the industry, so to speak. I've been a aficionado of jazz and a producer in a senior living community for the last 10 years. But for more than that, for 70 years, I've been mainly a listener and an aficionado. We went to a lot of concerts. We joined Jazz and Az, which was the local Arizona support group for jazz. I became active in several arts organizations on the board of Scottsdale Arts Center Association that had a jazz program as part of its annual panoply of performing arts that occurred on their stage. And as part of that, occasionally they would ask me for my opinion on who might be good to book into Scottsdale Center for the Arts. So that was a lot of fun. And I had an opportunity to have lunch with Marion McPartland, who had a program on National Public Radio for probably 25 years. She was a jazz piano player, and she brought all the top jazz piano players in to play with her. People listened to her by the thousands, and had a nice lunch with her. Had an opportunity to meet Dave Brubeck personally, who was playing for Scottsdale Arts. Heard the Count Basie Big Band when Count Basie was still alive. Carmen McRae, Ella Fitzgerald, Cleo Lane, Carlos Montoya on classical guitar, the gypsy jazz music of Django Reinhardt, rendered by a violinist. Just had a wonderful time listening to music down at Scottsdale Arts.
Was that like when you became a member of the Five Arts Circle?
Yes, later on, I myself and two other gentlemen had another notion, and the notion was that many of the people who are here in the wintertime, at least in that time back in the early 90s, we affectionately refer to them as snowbirds. They were from colder parts of the country, mainly the Midwest and East, and many of them were active supporters of arts organizations in the communities that they lived in the Midwest and the East. But when they came to Phoenix, they were, even though they were spending several months here, they did not necessarily get linked into what I'll call the arts support community. In other words, they weren't members of things like Scottsdale Arts or the opera or the ballet. They were attendees of concerts, and attendance at events like that only supply about 40 or 50% of the revenue required to book the fine artists in that are required to make a successful art season. The balance of the funds come from donors and sponsors, and donors and sponsors were not kicking in, and we actually had somewhat of a crisis. Ballet Arizona was about to close its doors because of a lack of funds. So very quickly, my friend Howard Hirsch, who was the inspirational leader for this, and myself and a couple of other guys got with the program, and we built a support group of 50 couples, donating $1,000 apiece to each of the 5 arts organizations that represented our program. With that money flowing in, Ballet Arizona was able to keep its door open, provided a little support for them. It's been going going on now for about 20 years and very successful.
Wow, that's fantastic. And to have been part of that change of it, like almost going out of business, to then like bring it back to life, like that must have been pretty incredible.
Well, it was very important, and the arts organizations were very kind to the members of the Five Arts Circle. They accorded us President's Club memberships in each of their organizations, which gave us opportunities to meet the musicians, and that stimulated further membership growth in Arizona Five Arts. And it's been a formula that's worked, as I say, over about 20 years with a lot of hard work by many volunteers in the community, including the leadership of Harry Papp, who's been the chairman for a number of years now. And Mr. Howard Hirsch unfortunately passed away about a year or so ago. So I think of the original founders, I'm the only one left, unfortunately, which is what happens to you when you get to be over 85.
Would you say that throughout your life, you said that you've been listening to so many various artists and met a lot of great musicians and a lot of great people that have like changed the industry, whether that be like saving a ballet company or going out and trying to find new ways for, you know, the residents to get involved in music and not have to travel too far. All of those experiences must have made you feel like so whole and love the music even more.
Well, it is a rewarding activity because music is so rewarding. I don't contribute anything to that. I don't play anything, and I don't inspire people through anything that I do other than organization. But the reflective value of that to the community is really important, and I feel those vibes, if you will, and compliments flow with it, which of course is an ego-stoking catalyst, if you will, to keep things going forward. So if you just do things one day at a time and you do them often enough, it winds up building up to something after a time. So we have just celebrated our 10th anniversary of the Woody's Place Jazz here at Sagewood, and over that period of time we've done about 105 concerts, live concerts, and we've had some of the outstanding performers in what I'll call the field of mainstream jazz, which includes not only instrumentals but vocals. I'll drop a few names on you. We've had the Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra. Through the generous funding of one of our residents, we're able to bring in the 18-piece Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra, which included a number of musicians who played in the original Stan Kenton group. The band at this point is continuing on. We presented them back in 2018, and of course Stan Kenton was deceased for many years prior to that, so this was his legacy orchestra, not himself personally, but many of the performers in the band were part of his original band over in California. It had a national and international footprint. He was a very well-known band leader, and his musicians were quite accomplished. So in addition to that, on the instrumental side, we have had the Brubeck brothers quartet play for us, which are the sons of Dave Brubeck, two of them with two other musicians. They're a very well-known modern jazz group.
That must have been insane to have seen their dad perform when you were 18 and then later on his children.
It was a nice opportunity for some remembrances. We had an opportunity to dine with Chris Brubeck and his lovely wife and some others, and kind of reminisce on the life of Dave Brubeck. And their presentation by the Brubeck brothers was very informative. They had a professionally done slideshow of the history of Dave Brubeck, his music, and where he performed, the awards that he won, and his life and his family. So it was a great experience for everybody. Very enjoyable for sure.
So when you're listening to jazz music, like what exactly about it gets you? Like why do you enjoy it so much?
Well, I guess fundamentally there are three components, rhythm, harmony, and melody. And it's simply the way that the musicians render whatever musical statement they're trying to make. They bring their artistry to it, and in some cases they innovate the number on the spot, which is called jazz improvisation. It has a component of surprise to it. The leader may announce a number, but you're going to hear it played by the musicians improvisationally in a way that has never been played before. So you get a chance to experience a new adventure, if you will, in music.
So you're saying that, like, if you were to go and watch these performances of these jazz musicians, you're never going to get the same piece over and over again? Like they'll always play it in a different way in order to surprise you?
Improvisation is one way the music can be presented. It can also be presented in a structured manner where everyone has sheet music and plays a composed arrangement. So it's not always improvisational, but it can be. And even when there's a composed structure, like let's say a big band chart, as they say, there'll be interludes where solos are taken, and those solos can be improvised. There's generally a bit of improvisation even when music is arranged, because the soloists are able to bring their particular skills to the audience.
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially because like they're given like a certain amount of time to do whatever they please as long as it connects with what they were playing before.
Right, a certain number of bars.
Mm-hmm. It got me thinking about just like how you were even able to meet all these like famous musicians. Like the fact that you were able to understand and recognize the importance of music and how each piece is created and why the music itself, each aspect of it, it all comes together to create this wonderful piece that delivers such an emotional message that you might not even be able to quite understand it after you initially listen to it, but like you just know it's important because it's what you feel.
Well, yes, and it's not so much that there's a lot of analysis. You don't particularly analyze what you just heard. You have what's called an afterglow, and we have concerts here where people will be talking about it for the next 2 weeks every time they meet in the hallway. Concert X wasn't that great. What did you think of this piano player? How about that vocalist? Wasn't she terrific? So it has an afterglow that I've often observed. If there were a pharmaceutical that could produce the feeling of well-being, recall of memory, camaraderie, cohesiveness of the audience, relationship with the musicians, and the afterglow of what was experienced, the positivity of it, it would sell $1 billion a year. There is no such medication, and I hope there never will be, because we want to promote the music as the experience.
Yes.
And it needs to be supported. And fortunately, we're in a community here that is doing a great job of supporting live music.
That's good to hear. And, there always needs to be more support for musicians in general, let alone live music, especially with the streaming services that are out there today. It's really hard to make money as a musician. So it's nice that you guys are able to bring people in and show some raw talent to the residents.
Yes, that's true. We're always seeking a combination in our programs. We're now booking our 11th year, and we have a combination of people coming back who are very popular and adding some new people to the program. So that's always important to keep things fresh and alive. And we're blessed by having very generous sponsors and patrons to help us do it, along with a wonderful management team that affords us the use of a wonderful performing arts center and provides some technical support in the way of our audio producer who supports our music program.
Well, that's fantastic. And just another quick question just about your experience with running the music programs at Sagewood. What type of involvement do you guys have with the MIM, which is the Music Instrument Museum?
Well, we have a very wonderful relationship with the Musical Instrument Museum. They offer around 300 live concerts a year, and frankly, many of us are over there a couple times a month at least. And I have a whole raft of tickets here on my shelf of upcoming concerts that I'll be attending. They're top musicians in the world. Many of them are musicians that would ordinarily play in much larger venues, but they choose to play at the Musical Instrument Museum in a 300-seat intimate setting because they enjoy that setting. They enjoy the acoustics. They enjoy the museum itself, the idea of the museum. They enjoy coming to the museum to visit it. The mission of the museum is something that they empathize with, and so it's a very successful operation. And we have the joy, if you will, of having that museum be a 90-second drive from Sagewood. Not 90 minutes, but 90 seconds. And it's walking distance. Our parking lots actually adjoin. And so we have had a program presented by the artistic director, Andrew Wallish. He's a performer in his own right. He presented a wonderful concert with a small band this past season, very well accepted. We have a lot of things in common with the Musical Instrument Museum. Many of our residents here at Sagewood are volunteers at the Musical Instrument Museum and members of some support groups like their Producers Circle, participants in some of their voluntary organizations like their musical book club, and a host of other things. So we're great neighbors of the MIM. They do a great job. We're fortunate to be associated with them.
That's fantastic. And I'm really glad that you guys have such a convenient place to go see live music that isn't too far. I think more people need to be doing that anyways by enjoying the music. And it's nice that these performers that are, big names are coming to Sagewood and performing this, really intimate setting where they don't have to, change themselves in a way. I feel, it's more comfortable as a performer, I think, to perform in a setting that's like only less than 400 seats.
Yes, we've benefited greatly from our association with several performing arts organizations where we've actually been able to engage in either, I call it co-bookings or tandem bookings, where they will have a group in and for a public performance, and we'll have them in on an adjacent day for a private performance at our place. And some of the organizations that have been cooperative in that way to a mutual benefit include the Ravenscroft, the Nash Club downtown, Scottsdale Center for the Arts, Tempe Center for the Arts, and Mesa Center for the Arts. So we've had a wonderful relationship with all of those organizations, and they all do an amazing job providing arts that are accessible to the local communities. In many places in the country, one has to drive, say, into New York City, get the kind of exposure that we can bring to people here fairly convenient to their own communities, typically with free parking, and it's a much different environment than going to a arts performance back in a rather congested city with difficult parking problems and other things that unfortunately are occurring. So we've enjoyed those relationships and hope to build on them for the future.
There's one more thing that I'd like to talk about before we get into whatever you feel the need to tell the audience. I think the audience should know about this book you recommended me. It's called This Is Your Brain on Music. One of the first things that you had told me before we decided to even record an episode with you was, you told me, you're like, Alex, you need to read this book all the way through before we have any episodes so you have a better understanding of how music affects the brain. And, I wanted to just say thank you for recommending me that I read this book, because there are a lot of things that had come up in the book that I wanted to talk about, but one thing in particular that kind of blew my mind, and it hit such a deep core because I had no idea that these two topics had that connection. But in the book, and I'm not going to give the rest of the book away because I think everybody needs to read it, there's a line that talks about how there are certain neurons that are activated in your brain, in the cerebellum, when you listen to music, that are the same neurons that are activated in deaf people's brains when they're using sign language. And I thought that was very fascinating because before I even decided to do this podcast, I thought I wanted to become a sign language interpreter. And I studied signing from my sophomore year up until a semester after I graduated from my undergrad. And I never really understood why I liked learning the language that much, but I always loved music. So to be able to finally see the connection between those two things was just mind-blowing. I just want to say thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome. We did have the author of This Is Your Brain on Music, Daniel Levitin. He came here and lectured for us, along with another author that was supported by a grant from Lee and Susan Burke, as a matter of fact. Among the other things that we learned from him are the ways that the brain forms to react to its environment, and particularly with music, there are parts of the brain where music is stored. And one of the things that's been noted is even people who have dementia, who have lost most of their memory, will still remember music. If you play music for them, oftentimes they'll be able to sing the lyrics. They might not have spoken regularly in months, but if you play for them or sing to them songs that they're familiar with, that recall happens and they experience the joy of the music. They begin to recall where they heard the music. And so it's very important to understand that listening to music has a physiological effect on the human brain. It became particularly significant to me as I went through another program I was doing called Musical Mondays. I was presenting video recordings of some of the major virtuoso players in jazz, and invariably in their bios you'd find that they began their musical experience when they were between 3 and 8 years old. I found that almost universally, that the people who rose to the top in music began their experience at those ages. Oftentimes for piano players, the household would one morning would break out in piano playing, and someone would say, "Who is that on the radio?" And they'd find out that little Johnny, who's 3.5 or 4 years old, would be playing the piano. and this would be amazing to people. And that actually has happened in the case of a lot of musicians, began their careers when they were very young. Mel Torme was making money singing music when he was about 5 years old. I'll tell you the story. It's kind of a cute story. So his parents were going to this Italian restaurant, and Mel was a radio listener when he was a little kid. Like me. He listened to radio back, and I think it was back in Chicago. At any rate, he learned a lot of the songs and whatever. So one evening he was in the Italian restaurant with his folks, their usual Friday night Italian dinner or whatever it was, and he began to sing what the band was playing, and it was engaging to everyone in the restaurant. The people thought it was really cute. And so the proprietor of the restaurant came to the Torme family and said, "If you'll bring little Mel back on Fridays, we'll pay for your dinner." so he was in effect bringing money into the family at age 5 based on his musical experience.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah.
And he knew all the words.
Oh yeah.
Wow, 5 years old. That's incredible. And what ended up happening from that point forward with the rest of his career?
He was a musical prodigy. He was a drummer. He was a composer. He composed the Christmas song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire. He was a vocalist. He vocalized with many orchestras and organizations. He had a relationship with George Shearing where they did concerts for about 20 years, concerts and recordings. There's a whole series of recordings of George Shearing with accompanying Mel Torme. They're absolutely fantastic. He was a very innovative vocalist with incredible skills. He wasn't the most popular vocalist in the world. He began being called the Velvet Fog, and later on he put on a little weight, so he became the Velvet Frog. I'm having a little fun with Mel Torme's memory there. At any rate, he was a terrific performer, and I would commend anybody to give a listen to his recordings because you'll hear some wonderful stuff.
Well, I will have to check out Mel Torme when I get home.
Absolutely.
But before we end your episode, Martin, I want to give you the chance to say whatever you think is important for everyone to know, whether it be like a quote, just something that you live by.
Well, I've been blessed to be living here in this community because they've been supportive of something that has been important to me over the years, that is music. It's been a blessing to be able to have their support and to use that support to bring in music that they enjoy. And so it's been a wonderful partnership. I've enjoyed working with the community and in particular with the wonderful volunteers who help us. It's not just myself, it's a whole team of volunteers. We do everything from booking musicians, contracting with agencies, making airline arrangements, making accommodation arrangements, making arrangements to do the technical production of the music, and promoting the music with a number of publications that we put out every year. There's graphic design involved. We put out a season brochure, and this requires a lot of work, and we have volunteer teams that help us with all that. So it's been a blessing for me. It's given me something to do in my waning years, and looking forward to every minute of what is remaining.
Well, that's good to hear. I really appreciate you taking your time to tell everybody about your story and how music has made you who you are, and thank you again.
Thank you, Alex.
Well, to the listeners out there, to wherever you are, I wish you happiness and good health.